Well, welcome back. I hope you're well. It's a pleasure once again to have you join me. Let me encourage you before I start today's session to join me by engaging in the conversations and the lectures that I have been sharing. You can do so by expressing your views about what you have heard, whether you dislike, like, agree, disagree. We welcome, in this channel, I welcome dissent. I welcome vigorous debate. I welcome those who see things differently to myself. All views are welcome. But you can also engage by subscribing if you haven't. You can like, you can dislike, choose whichever of the two you want. But that would show me and give me some feedback, obviously, so I can moderate what I'm sharing. But let's get started. Let's start today's conversation. For 6 prior sessions, I've talked about several topics, but primarily my focus has been on relationships and whether you were prepared for success in your relationships. And I have started the process with what I think has been a different perspective to get you thinking about your upbringing, your environment, and the social landscape. In the previous session, I talked about the impact that the social landscape has had on relationships. I connected 3 or 4 different dots. The generations that came before your parents, the technological developments that occurred as a result of innovation during the period in the last century, and then the government's involvement, whether that be through the welfare state or the NHS for healthcare, or the laws that have been written and therefore limited the responsibilities that we once had as sovereign individuals, and therefore the movement away from individual responsibility to self, from individual responsibility to social responsibility. The fourth and the concluding connection in the prior session had to do with an ideology. The ideology was called feminism, and is still called feminism. That was where we got to yesterday. In today's session, I'm going to move slightly away from where we got to yesterday, with the intention being to provide more information that perhaps could be of value. We have looked at the social. The key question that I did not address in the prior session, which I hope to talk about today, is how do we solve this issue? Now, you might be thinking, Mentor, I have heard what you have to say. All well and good. Great monologues. What are the solutions? And this is where I will start to provide some ideas to help you tailor what could be a formula for success in your relationships. Now, to do so, I'm going to address the solution in 3 groups. Success in dating, success in relationships, and success in marriage. But let's begin by looking at how our social environment and what I discussed in the prior session has to do with our lived experience. Now, the 4 things I talked about as being hindrances to why we struggle in relationships in the modern West. Now, let me stop and pause. Let me make it very clear that whilst I speak, I'm talking about modern dating, modern men and modern women within a geographical location that I call the West, but specifically the modern West. And this has to do with places that are not just based on latitude and longitude, or based on continents, but based on what I consider to be a value system. Places where you've had the Judeo-Christian values, the Western civilization, the importance of the sovereignty of the individual, separation between church and state, the rule of law. The modern West. If I could categorize these into, or group them into specific countries, in North America, it would include the United States of America and Canada. It would also include, if you were to move away from the continent of North America, it would include the United Kingdom and parts of West Europe or Western Europe. Most of the countries that are still within the old frame of what we call the Baltic or the Slavic countries still have elements of the traditional values, and they haven't lost or bought into the whole Western ideology completely. Poland, the Czech Republic, parts of Ukraine, places like Croatia, places like I would say Lithuania, and all the other regions. They still have elements of their traditional values that have kept them protected from a lot of the issues that I covered in the prior sessions. Now, I thought it would be useful to make that distinction. Places in the East, and places in Africa are exempt in the main from the categorizations that I used in the prior sessions. There are some subtle corrections if you want to apply the teachings to areas outside of the modern West. Now, with that said, let's look at the 4 or 5 things that I identified in the prior session. The first was the generations that came before us, and I did a useful comparison between the various generations. The Great Generation, the Silent Generation, the Baby Boomers, Generation X, Generation Y or the Millennials, Generation Z, Generation A. And I gave you, as I concluded, what I thought perhaps was a way of understanding whether you were primed or programmed, or whether you were groomed, trained for success. But if we put the generations aside, what we're looking at the following: the role of the state and the laws that have been enacted that have hindered and have been a deliberate attack on the family unit. The breakdown of the family perhaps should be a national crisis in the whole West, in my opinion. The deliberate disintegration by decisions made by the state is something we don't talk about. The second then being the welfare state and whatever alternative or derivative of the welfare state in the UK is the healthcare system. The third would be the technologies, the pill, and even to an extent abortions, that have taken away self-responsibility, consequences and shame, have taken away the price that women once paid and the price that men paid by making decisions in what I would call lost as opposed to long-term or long-sighted. And then finally, the ideology. Now, of the 4 things that I have described, the one thing we know that will not change, if you were to go one by one, is that the possibility that we will pull away the state and push the state away so much that the laws are, you might say, withdrawn, changed, repealed, and the state is not involved in the day-to-day matters of family and individuals, it's impossible. That will never happen. Number 2, the technologies and the innovations. The pill was a great innovation, but the idea that the pill is doing more good than harm is laughable. Those who are medical experts will tell you have issues with carcinogenic effects, you have issues with hormonal effect on women, you have issues with the fact that the pill was not designed for young girls to take them from age 15 or 16 and do so for 30 years or do so for 20 years. The body keeps the score always. That will not change, because to make any changes there will be seen as though you're attacking the rights of women. Abortions are there for women to choose and use as they please. If you rule abortions as being illegal, that would seem as though perhaps the progress that has been made in the woman, to afford women with opportunities and free choice will be, I guess, you might say rescinded. It will not fly. We'll move to the next one, which has to do with if the state cannot go away, and the welfare system cannot go away, and the technologies will not go away, we're left with the fourth and the final, which is the ideology, feminism. And when I talk about feminism, and when men generally talk about feminism, there is this gritting of teeth amongst women, because the feeling is that we're attacking the great God, whoever she is, and that there is something wrong with that. Feminism had its benefits, like all things, but there were consequences that were not considered. I have said before, and I did so in the prior session, that choices come with costs, constraints, consequences, and trade-offs. And generally speaking, this is the best way to think about any ideology you have, whether that be Christianity, Buddhism, Islam. It could also just be your personal ideologies, political, social, moral, ethical, whatever they might be. Whenever the values and the ideologies or the ideas that people believe in are considered to be more superior than the relationships, then without exceptions, and without any exception, the relationship or the system that connects people is at risk of being destroyed. And that is what we've seen with the ideology of feminism. We're not allowed to criticize it, even though we know that a broken clock is right twice every day, which means that there are some good aspects to feminism, but there are also some bad aspects. I should say, the gender war is over. We had the Treaty of Versailles, or the equivalent of the Treaty of Versailles, with regards to gender rights. Men and women are no longer fighting each other. In the early and in the turn of the 20th century, 1912 to 1918, our parliament passed the right of women to vote. And since then, we've seen tremendous progress in equality, so much so that in the UK today, there are no rights that men have that women do not have. You cannot say the same for the reverse or for the inverse. We have equality of opportunity. It's even corrected far to the other side between men and women. We have equality of rights. We're equal under the law. We're equal citizens. We're equal in God's sight as sovereign beings. The war is over. Unfortunately, what we've found is that the attack and the hatred towards the masculine frame and masculinity, or the male avatar, has been relentless. You see this all over commercials, the television, even in news. The attack on masculinity is so strong that men have actually, and young men, are bearing the brunt of all of this attack. Now, why have I said, and have I focused on feminism? Well, it is an ideology. You see, the other three that I mentioned, the state and its involvement, and the laws, is not an ideology. It's concrete. It's written into law. The technologies and the innovations are not ideologies. They are concrete. They are available. Therefore, the two are very hard to change. The welfare state and its derivatives are not ideologies. They are here to stay. Feminism is one ideology that people can choose. It's the same as choosing a religion or choosing a political affiliation. You can choose. If you are a young woman below the age of 35, and you live in the West, there is probably about an 85-90% chance that you have been indoctrinated with this ideology, and implicitly or explicitly your decisions are being guided by this belief system. So your belief system effectively formulates your view of the world, and at the core is that men are evil. Men have done harm to women in the past, and there is nothing good that comes from men. Now, I've said this before, I will say this again. I have a view that the women who spout such perspectives have never had a really loving relationship with any man in their entire life. Whether that be a loving relationship with a father, a brother, a loved one, a friend, never. Because you cannot, and this is perhaps where the dichotomy comes in, you cannot have a hatred for men so strong, but also have a love for a father, a brother, a loved one, or a friend. You can't have it both ways. I see women who speak about men so in such a hating manner. You know, misandry is something we don't talk about. The contempt and the hatred for men is so strong. Without realizing this, most younger girls are buying into this ideology, maybe not as strongly as the older ones, perhaps who've had no success or loving relationship with a man. And for those who might say, I disagree with you, I have a father and I have a good relationship with my father, I will qualify that by saying a loving relationship with a man who by his choice had been allowed to express himself as a man. Most men these days, and I went through the conversation in the prior session of how we created 2-3 generations of softer men and harder women. So you find men that are feminized and they can't speak as men because obviously they fear the retribution from their loved ones. They were raised without a father in the home. They don't have a masculine frame. They're more feminine in their disposition and behavior and mannerisms and temperament. We don't classify those. We put those to the side, not because they are not valid and men in their rights, but because they've been conditioned to think with the feminine lens as opposed to the masculine lens. In any case, how do we turn around this, I guess, lack of success in relationships? Well, the first thing is to start with the ideas that you have control over. I am reminded by something called the Venn diagram, where you have 2 circles, and you bring the 2 circles into 2, and what you find is that where they intersect is a shaded area. One circle represents things that matter. The other circle represents things that you can control. There are things that matter in life, and there are things that you can control and things that you cannot control. And one of the things that you should always try to do is focus, always focus on where those 2 diagrams or circles intersect. Because if you do not allow yourself the discipline of sticking to or staying within the margins of what is important, what you might find is that you're distracted and you pursue so many distractions. sacrificing your time and your energy on what matters. So, as a human being, as a young man or as a young woman, we are where we are. The question is, if you want a different outcome, a successful outcome in your relationships, there are some ideas that you must learn. There are other ideas that you should unlearn. And perhaps there might be a few ideas that you should relearn, things that were told to you, but perhaps for some reason you forgot those issues or those lessons or those, you might say, precepts. It all begins with the information we choose to take into our subconscious mind. Now, I have found, and this is where my lesson today begins, I have found that there are really two ways of making a change in your life, and a profound change. The first is not perhaps ideal. The first comes with a shock to your system, like a wake-up call. You know, someone who's been eating very poorly and never taking care of their health for 40 years suddenly goes to see his GP, and the GP says, if you do not make significant changes, you'll be dead in 6 months. And that is a shock to the system. It causes the person to wake up. The person has to decide whether the path that they have been going on is what they want, or whether they want to make a change. A wake-up call, something that jars you, an accident, a loved one who files for divorce and says, I'm filing for divorce because I've had enough of you, enough of the ill treatments and all of that. Something that jars you to consider a different perspective. Now, the reason that first option is not ideal is because for so many people, it comes sometimes too little and too late. So let's bring this into relationships. We talk about men and we talk about women. The wake-up call for men is when we realize at 40, 50, that we've actually done nothing with our lives. We've squandered our gifts and talents. We still live a life that is not meaningful enough, having never achieved anything of significance. In relationships, we realize that we do not have the relationships that we crave. Now, for women, this often comes when a woman hits about 40, having bought into the feminist BS for so many years, and at some point between 35 and 40, she realizes that the men who tolerated that ideology purely for access to her body have shrunk. And there aren't that many suitors. Her biological clock is kicking in. Her biological urges are screaming. And she realizes, well, there must be a reason why I cannot find a good man and a man of value and a man who other people recognize as being valuable. And unfortunately, what you find is that with such experiences, it's too little, too late. And most women in that category often say, I wish I had learned a different ideology, a different way, early. That's the first. Now, the second way of learning is through what I call spaced repetition. We learn through spaced repetition. This is where we substitute one bad idea for something better, for something good. But we do so through study. We seek information and we use information as an antidote to ignorance. You see, on one side, like I discussed in the second session, is ignorance, and the other side is knowledge. But knowledge comes through study. Study and the pursuit of knowledge and information, and the truth, the pursuit of the truth about men, creates an awareness about what men are and who men are and what we want and how to coexist with a man. See, most women who are feminists, and most women generally below the age of 40, have a lot of ignorance about men. Their picture of men sometimes are planted by other people. It's a seed. It doesn't come from their lived experience, It comes from the fears they have. But here is the key thing. Ignorance, unfortunately, is so powerful that it causes fear. But before the fear comes on, what you have is worry and doubt. Speak to any young woman under 40, but within the dating range or age, 18 to 40, and most of them talk about worry and doubts about relationships. Now, worry and doubt is simply a manifestation of ignorance. On one side, you have ignorance, which leads to worry and doubt, which manifests itself in fear. That fear is expressed through the body because the body is the only instrument through which it can express itself. Fear is an emotion. It expresses itself through the body in the form of what we call anxiety. So most women have an anxiety about men because of the perception about men. That anxiety, unfortunately, for most people, is not shared in a positive way so that it can be displaced, which means people suppress the anxiety, which leads to depression. Most feminists are internally depressed. From a relationship perspective, they're frustrated. Now, how do you resolve that? Well, you go all the way back to the top. We begin with ignorance. The opposite of ignorance, if you were to go by what we call the law of polarity, for every positive there is a negative. Ignorance is a negative, you might say, a negative energy state. You replace it with knowledge. But that knowledge comes through study. If you're listening to this, this is a way of obtaining information through study. By studying more about men, by being curious about men and fascinated about men rather than apprehensive, what you find is that you increase your level of awareness. That raised level of awareness allows you to substitute the concern you had, which was fear, with faith. Faith comes by hearing and hearing and hearing. The belief in things unseen. The hope in a better future. That the idea is to believe that good things are supposed to happen to you in your relationships. But that comes through study and studying the right information and substituting the negative form of ignorance with a positive form of light. Faith, when faith comes into your life, what you find, rather than be anxious, what you have is well-being, a feeling of a lightness about you. In your relationships, you're free. You're not competing about gender issues. You're not competing about who has to win. You're not looking for a partner. You're looking for a union. You're looking for some form of a structure with a man because you believe that you understand men, but you also understand yourself. By placing your body at ease, what you find is that in your relationships, and this is key, women who know a lot about men, you find actually that they have a life that is accelerating. It's accelerating at a pace because they are not depressed. They are at ease because of the faith they have, which has come from the awareness they have about men, and because of the knowledge they know about men. You see, if you have the knowledge, then you understand how to coexist with a man. You understand how to communicate with a man. You're not worried. You're not doubtful of his words and his actions. You're not panicking. You're not fearful because you have understanding. The key is understanding. Hence, the ancient writers' recommendations that in all you're getting, get understanding. It says wisdom is supreme, but in all thy getting, get understanding. Information that is studied leads to knowledge. If you comprehend the knowledge through raised awareness, you have what we call comprehension. Comprehension means you understand. This next step is actually to apply what you know. That leads to wisdom through application. If you have wisdom, relationships become easy. Life becomes joyful. You find actually you go through life at an accelerated pace because you have the information needed to make the right decisions. And even when you come across obstacles, you can pause because you understand that actually you can find a way to resolve issues. By following the steps that I've suggested through study and through spaced repetition, what you find is you start to displace a lot of the knowledge you have and the feminist ideal and ideas, especially the wrong ones. You start to displace them with a peaceful ideology. An ideology that recommends and says that it's okay to consider the benefits of interrelationships where you're dependent on other people and they're dependent on you, but you have a mutual agreed vision and there is consent on all issues. That is the only way that changes can be made. So, in the sessions to follow, I'm going to start breaking down and I'm going to pose what I call new questions. Were you trained or prepared to be a wife? Were you taught how to be a wife? And that's for relationships and marriage. Were you taught how to be the right girlfriend or boyfriend? Relationships. And were you taught how to date? Now, I hope that's been useful.